Omega Station hosted what could only be described as the most pretentious gathering of brilliant minds the galaxy had ever produced. The Intergalactic Xenobiology Symposium. Picture, if you will, a space station the size of Manhattan floating in the void, its crystalline spires reaching toward distant stars while housing the most insufferably intelligent beings from 17 different star systems. The station's bioluminescent walls pulsed with a gentle blue glow that supposedly aided concentration, though it mostly served to make everyone look vaguely nauseated. Today's theme was Apex Predators, death incarnate across the cosmos, because apparently regular academic conferences weren't dramatic enough. The galaxy's foremost xenobiologists had gathered to present their findings on the most terrifying creatures their respective worlds had to offer. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy, as beings with too many degrees and not enough common sense prepared to one-up each other with increasingly horrific examples of evolutionary perfection. Dr. Amelia Holt stood backstage, adjusting her simple black blazer while listening to the controlled chaos around her. At 35, she was remarkably unremarkable by galactic standards. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of face that could disappear in a crowd of 3. This was, she'd learned, incredibly useful when studying alien psychology. The Vorthak Shadow Stalker, announced Dr. Helixstan, a crystalline scholar whose voice sounded like wind chimes having an existential crisis, can phase through solid matter while maintaining molecular cohesion. It feeds on the electrical impulses of living brains, essentially consuming thoughts themselves. The audience made appreciative gurgling sounds, the Blorgian equivalent of applause. Amelia resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Show-offs. Fascinating, whispered Dr. Ontopy, a spider-like arachnoid whose 8 eyes made it impossible to tell where she was looking. Though I submit that the Crimson Devourers of Kepler 442b are far more efficient. They reproduce by implanting their young directly into the spinal columns of living hosts, who remain conscious throughout the 3-week gestation period. Several audience members shuddered, their various appendages twitching with sympathetic horror. Amelia checked her watch, a simple analog device that seemed almost primitive compared to the holographic displays everyone else wore. Nearly her turn. The current presenter, a gelatinous mass calling itself Professor Globulon, was describing something called a reality ripper, apparently a creature that could tear holes in the fabric of space-time to hunt prey across dimensions. The projection showed a writhing mass of tentacles and teeth that defied Euclidean geometry. As you can observe, Globulon bubbled enthusiastically, the Reality Ripper's extra-dimensional hunting technique allows it to bypass all known defensive mechanisms. No shelter, no armor, no technology can protect against a predator that attacks from angles that don't technically exist. The audience was eating it up. Literally, in some cases, the Consumoy delegate had already begun absorbing the empty seats around it in excitement. Amelia glanced at her presentation slide one more time. It was refreshingly simple compared to the multimedia extravaganzas her colleagues had prepared. Just a title and a silhouette. No animations, no holographic reconstructions, no dramatic music. Her advisor back on Earth had warned her that subtlety was wasted on academic audiences, but Amelia had always preferred the direct approach. And now, announced the moderator, a pompous ethereal whose translucent form flickered with self-importance, we welcome Dr. Amelia Holt from the Terran Research Institute. Her presentation concerns what she claims is Earth's most dangerous predator. A ripple of polite interest passed through the crowd. Earth was still considered something of a backwater planet by galactic standards, recently discovered, sparsely populated, and home to beings that most civilized species found quaint at best. What could such a primitive world possibly contribute to a symposium featuring reality rippers and shadow stalkers? Dr. Holt has studied predator-prey relationships across 14 different star systems, the moderator continued, clearly reading from notes, and holds advanced degrees in both xenobiology and comparative psychology. Her work on cross-species behavioral analysis has been adequate, damning with faint praise, the academic equivalent of a pat on the head. Amelia smiled tightly and walked toward the podium. The audience settled into their seats, Various forms of skeptical attention focused on the unremarkable human approaching the stage. She reached the podium and connected her simple datapad to the presentation system. The massive holographic display behind her flickered to life, showing her single slide in all its understated glory. "Earth's Most Dangerous Predator," read the title in plain, unadorned text. Below it was a simple black silhouette. Humanoid, bipedal, completely ordinary by galactic standards. No claws, no fangs, no reality warping abilities. Just a basic outline that could have been any of a dozen species. The audience shifted restlessly. After presentations featuring creatures that could devour thoughts and hunt across dimensions, this seemed almost boring. Several beings began whispering among themselves, wondering if there had been some sort of technical malfunction. Amelia looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Compound eyes, sensor arrays, and things that might have been faces but defied easy categorization. She could feel their anticipation, their barely concealed condescension, their assumption that the primitive human was about to embarrass herself in front of the galaxy's intellectual elite. Then she stepped away from the podium and stood perfectly still. The whispers died as the audience waited for her to continue. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Amelia remained motionless, hands at her sides, breathing so slowly it was barely perceptible. Her eyes never left the audience, but she wasn't looking at anyone in particular. She was simply present. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Academic presentations had rhythms, expected patterns of introduction, evidence and conclusion. This wasn't following any recognizable format. Some audience members glanced around nervously, unsure if they were witnessing a technical difficulty or some obscure human custom. The moderator cleared his throat, a sound like static electricity given voice. "Dr. Holt, is there a problem with your presentation?" Amelia didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She simply stood there, as still as a statue, as patient as stone, as silent as the space between stars. And for the first time in their distinguished careers, the galaxy's most brilliant minds began to feel like prey. Standing before an audience of the galaxy's most accomplished xenobiologists while doing absolutely nothing required a particular kind of confidence that most beings simply didn't possess. Amelia Holt, however, had spent the better part of her career studying the behavioral patterns of species that could casually obliterate solar systems, so a room full of academic egos hardly fazed her. The holographic display behind her continued to show that maddeningly simple slide, Earth's Most Dangerous Predator, with its unremarkable silhouette. No pulsing animations, no dramatic zoom effects, no three-dimensional reconstructions of gnashing teeth or reality-warping appendages, just a basic outline that seemed almost insulting in its ordinariness. After the multimedia spectacles that had preceded it, Dr. Helixthan's crystalline structure flickered with what his species considered polite confusion. The crystallines were beings of pure logic, their thoughts processed through living mineral matrices that had evolved beyond the need for messy biological impulses. They found inefficiency personally offensive, and standing silently on stage was about as inefficient as communication could get. "Perhaps," Helixthan ventured, his voice carrying the musical quality of resonating crystal, "the human requires technical assistance? Their species is known for struggling with advanced presentation systems." A few polite chuckles rippled through the audience, the kind of condescending amusement that academics reserved for colleagues from less developed civilizations. The ethereal moderator's translucent form shimmered with barely contained annoyance. Schedule disruptions were the enemy of proper academic discourse. Amelia remained motionless. Her breathing was so controlled it was almost imperceptible, her posture relaxed but alert. She wasn't looking at any specific individual, but somehow every being in the auditorium felt the weight of her attention. It was distinctly uncomfortable. Professor Globalon, still riding the high of his reality Ripper presentation, pulsed with what might have been concern. "The human appears to be malfunctioning," he gurgled helpfully. "Perhaps we should summon medical assistance? I understand their species is prone to random system failures." The suggestion sparked a wave of whispered consultations. The arachnoid delegation huddled together, their 8 eyes darting between Amelia and the exits. The consumoids had stopped their habitual snacking and were actually paying attention for once. Even the notoriously arrogant hegemony representatives seemed unsettled by the humans' inexplicable behavior. Minutes continued to crawl by with the enthusiasm of a dying star. The silence had weight now, pressing down on the assembled academics like a physical force. What had started as mild confusion was evolving into something more primal, a creeping sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. Dr. Ontep's mandibles clicked nervously. The arachnoids were natural predators themselves, ambush hunters who understood the value of patience and stillness. But this wasn't hunting behavior as they recognized it. This was something else entirely. Something that triggered ancient survival instincts they'd thought they'd evolved beyond. "I propose," announced Dr. Vextai, a hegemony scholar whose purple skin had flushed to an alarming shade of magenta, "that we move on to the next presentation. Clearly, the human is experiencing some sort of cultural difficulty." The suggestion was greeted with murmurs of agreement. The hegemony prided themselves on their sophisticated understanding of primitive species, and they'd obviously encountered this sort of behavioral anomaly before. Best to treat it with the patient condescension reserved for confused children. But Amelia didn't move. She didn't acknowledge the suggestion, didn't show any sign of embarrassment or confusion. She simply continued to stand there, as still as a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moderator cleared his throat again, the sound now carrying a note of genuine concern. "Dr. Holt, I'm afraid we really must insist that you either continue with your presentation or yield the floor to—" He stopped mid-sentence. There was something about the way the human was looking at them now, something that made his ethereal form flicker with involuntary alarm. Her eyes weren't fixed on any particular individual, but somehow every being in the room felt personally observed, catalogued, assessed. The audience was beginning to fidget in ways that had nothing to do with academic impatience. The crystalline's harmonious resonance was developing discordant notes. The consumoids had unconsciously formed defensive clusters. Even the supremely confident hegemony delegates were exchanging glances that suggested they'd encountered something outside their considerable experience. "This is highly irregular," muttered Dr. Fentak, a Blorgian whose translator was having difficulty with the nervous clicking sounds he was making. "Humans are supposed to be chatty creatures. They never shut up about their feelings and their primitive philosophies. This silence is unnatural." The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Unnatural. Coming from a galaxy full of beings who could phase through dimensions and devour thoughts, that was saying something. Amelia shifted her weight slightly, the first movement she'd made since stepping away from the podium. It was barely perceptible, just a subtle redistribution of balance that somehow managed to be more unsettling than complete stillness. Several audience members actually flinched. "Security," called out Dr. Vextai, his voice climbing toward panic. "I think we need security. The human may be malfunctioning, but the security personnel, a mix of various species trained in crowd control and emergency response, were conspicuously absent. They were supposed to be monitoring the symposium, but none of them had appeared, despite the increasingly obvious distress of the audience. The realization crept through the assembled academics like ice water through their various circulatory systems. They were trapped in an auditorium with a human who was doing absolutely nothing, and somehow that nothing was more terrifying than reality rippers and shadow stalkers combined. Because for the first time in their distinguished careers, the galaxy's most brilliant minds were beginning to understand that they were being hunted. They just couldn't figure out how, or by what, or why standing perfectly still could possibly be a hunting technique. Amelia Holt continued to wait, patient as entropy, still as the space between atoms, and utterly, completely in control of a room full of beings who had never felt more like prey in their lives. The silence stretched on, thick with possibility, and heavy with the weight of something vast and inevitable approaching, something that wore the face of an unremarkable human woman who had somehow turned an academic presentation into a demonstration of predatory superiority without saying a single word. And in that moment, suspended between confusion and terror, the audience finally began to understand what they were looking at. 10 minutes of absolute silence had transformed the galaxy's most prestigious academic gathering into something resembling a nature documentary. Specifically, the part where the gazelles suddenly realized the tall grass is moving in ways that grass shouldn't move. The difference was that these particular gazelles had advanced degrees and a collective IQ that could calculate the heat death of the universe. Yet they were being systematically unnerved by a human woman doing absolutely nothing. Dr. Helixdan's crystalline structure had developed a hairline fracture near what might have been his left temple, a stress response that typically only occurred when his species encountered mathematical paradoxes. The crystallines prided themselves on their logical perfection, their ability to process any situation through pure, rational analysis. But rationality required data, and the human was providing none. "This is absurd," he announced, his voice carrying the brittle quality of breaking glass. "She's clearly malfunctioning. Humans are social creatures. They communicate constantly, share their thoughts, seek approval from their peers. This behavior is completely contrary to their established psychological profile." But even as he spoke, Helixfan found himself lowering his voice to a whisper. Something about the human's presence demanded quiet, the way ancient cathedrals demanded reverence. The comparison was not comforting. Professor Globulan's gelatinous mass had begun to ripple with nervous energy. His species communicated through biochemical signals, releasing pheromones that conveyed complex emotional states. The cocktail of fear sense currently emanating from the audience was making him dizzy. "I've studied over 3,000 species," he bubbled quietly, "and I've never encountered a predator that hunts by doing nothing. It defies every principle of evolutionary biology. Predators act, they pursue, they strike. They don't stand around like decorative statuary." The arachnoid delegation had formed a defensive circle, their 8 eyes constantly scanning for threats that weren't there. Dr. Ontepi's mandibles clicked in rapid-fire patterns, the equivalent of nervous humming, but with more potential for accidental dismemberment. "Wait," she whispered, her voice carrying the sudden clarity of revelation. "Wait. What if this is the hunting behavior?" The suggestion hit the audience like a quantum torpedo. Several beings actually recoiled, their various appendages twitching with sympathetic alarm. The idea that standing still could be a hunting technique was so fundamentally alien to their understanding of predator-prey dynamics that it bordered on the metaphysical. "That's ridiculous," snapped Dr. Vextai, though his purple skin had now faded to a sickly lavender. "Predators chase prey. They don't stand around waiting for their victims to... He trailed off, because the logical conclusion of that sentence was too unsettling to voice. If this was hunting behavior, then what exactly was being hunted? And more importantly, what was supposed to happen next? The moderator's ethereal form flickered with increasing instability. His species existed partially outside normal space-time, which gave them a unique perspective on the flow of events. Right now, that perspective was telling him that something significant was approaching, something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everyone present. "Ladies, gentlemen, and indeterminate entities," he announced, his voice carrying the desperate cheer of someone trying to maintain normalcy in the face of cosmic horror, "perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow Dr. Holt to collect herself." But nobody moved. The audience remained frozen in their seats, unable to look away from the human who had somehow turned their academic symposium into a psychological thriller. It was like watching a supernova in slow motion, terrifying, but impossible to ignore. Dr. Fenthek's translator was now producing sounds that weren't quite words, just electronic approximations of existential dread. "She's been standing there for 11 minutes and 37 seconds. He reported with the obsessive precision of someone clinging to facts in a world that had stopped making sense. "No movement, no vocalization, no indication of awareness. It's like she's waiting." The word sent a collective shiver through the auditorium. Waiting implied patience, and patience implied planning, and planning implied intelligence far beyond what most species attributed to humans. The uncomfortable truth was beginning to dawn on them. They were dealing with something that had anticipated their reactions and prepared accordingly. Commander Brixholt of the Hegemony military delegation had been quietly analyzing the situation through his tactical implants. His species had conquered half the galaxy through superior strategy and overwhelming force, but right now his combat algorithms were producing error messages. How do you fight an enemy that isn't attacking? How do you defend against a threat that consists entirely of standing still? This is psychological warfare, he announced, with the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally identified the nature of the problem. The human is using our own expectations against us. She's weaponized our confusion. The observation sparked a wave of nervous discussion. Psychological warfare was a recognized discipline, but it typically involved propaganda, intimidation, or complex manipulation tactics. It didn't involve standing silently on a stage while brilliant minds slowly drove themselves insane, trying to understand what was happening. Dr. Ontepi's 8 eyes had locked onto Amelia with the intensity of a targeting system. "Look at her breathing," she whispered. "It's completely controlled. Her heart rate is probably steady, her stress hormones minimal. She's not confused or malfunctioning. She's exactly where she wants to be." The implications of that statement hit the audience like a cascade of falling dominoes. If the human wasn't distressed by the situation, if she was actually comfortable with the increasingly panicked response of the galaxy's intellectual elite, then this was all part of some larger design. "She's studying us," breathed Dr. Helixton, his crystalline structure now showing multiple stress fractures. "We came here to learn about predators, and she's turned us into a live demonstration. We're the specimens now." The auditorium erupted in a chaos of whispered consultations, nervous gestures, and the kind of intellectual panic that only occurred when very smart beings realized they'd been comprehensively outmaneuvered. The carefully structured hierarchy of the symposium was crumbling as academics from dozens of species found themselves united in their shared confusion and growing terror. And through it all, Amelia Holt continued to stand perfectly still, patient as a black hole, silent as the void between galaxies, and completely in control of a room full of beings who were only now beginning to understand what it meant to be prey to something that didn't need claws or fangs or reality-warping abilities, because the most dangerous predator in the galaxy, they were learning, was the one that could turn your own mind against you without lifting a finger. The silence stretched on, pregnant with revelation and heavy with the weight of a lesson being taught to students who had never realized they were enrolled in the class. After precisely 15 minutes and 43 seconds of the most educational silence in galactic history, Amelia Holt finally spoke. Her voice carried the casual confidence of someone who had just concluded a successful experiment, which, in retrospect, was exactly what had happened. "Persistence hunting," she said, her words falling into the stunned silence like stones into still water. "That's what most xenobiologists focus on when they study human predatory behavior. Our ancestors could chase prey across vast distances, running them to exhaustion over hours or days. Impressive, certainly, but hardly unique in the galaxy." The audience remained frozen, afraid that any movement might trigger whatever terrible revelation was approaching. Several beings were still holding their breath, having forgotten that respiration was generally considered important for continued existence. "But persistence hunting was never our most dangerous adaptation," Amelia continued, stepping back toward the podium with movements so casual they seemed almost insulting after the psychological torment of the past quarter hour. "What made humans truly dangerous wasn't our ability to chase prey across continents. It was our ability to make other predators afraid of standing still." Dr. Helixtan's crystalline structure produced a sound like wind chimes falling down a staircase. I don't understand. How does making predators afraid of stillness constitute a hunting technique?" Amelia smiled, the first expression she'd shown since taking the stage. It was not a comforting sight. "Because, Dr. Helixan, the most dangerous thing about humans isn't that we're predators. It's that we're social predators. We don't just hunt individuals, we hunt entire societies, entire ways of thinking, entire concepts of what's possible. She gestured toward the audience with casual ease, as if she were indicating items on a shopping list rather than describing the systematic psychological dismantling of the galaxy's intellectual elite. For the past 15 minutes, I've done absolutely nothing. I've stood here, breathed regularly, and observed. And in that time, every single one of you has experienced something your species evolved specifically to avoid: the helpless terror of being prey to something you can't understand, can't fight, and can't escape. The words hit the auditorium like a tactical nuclear weapon made of pure, crystallized truth. Several audience members actually whimpered, a sound that suggested their various vocal apparatus had evolved primarily for expressing existential dread. But here's the truly terrifying part, Amelia continued, her voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining basic arithmetic to exceptionally slow students. I didn't use any special technology. I didn't employ psychic powers or dimensional manipulation. I didn't even speak until this moment. I simply stood still and let you demonstrate why humans are the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Professor Globulon's gelatinous mass was now vibrating at frequencies that suggested imminent structural collapse. But that's impossible. Predation requires action, requires engagement with the prey species. You can't hunt by doing nothing. Can't I? Amelia asked, raising an eyebrow with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of devastating rhetorical questions. In the past 15 minutes, I've learned more about your species' psychological weaknesses than most researchers gather in decades of study. I've identified your stress responses, your hierarchical structures, your decision-making processes under pressure. She paused, letting the implications sink into minds that were desperately trying to process information that challenged their fundamental understanding of predator-prey dynamics. I've watched you form defensive clusters, seen which species default to aggression under stress and which ones seek consensus. I've observed your leadership patterns, your communication styles, your individual breaking points. Most importantly, I've demonstrated that your superior technology and advanced intelligence mean absolutely nothing when faced with a predator that understands psychology better than you understand yourselves. The audience was beginning to hyperventilate, a challenging process for species with radically different respiratory systems, but they were managing admirably. The realization was spreading through the auditorium like a viral revelation. They hadn't just been observed. They'd been catalogued, analyzed, and filed away for future reference. This is why humans are Earth's most dangerous predator, Amelia explained, with the patient tone of someone addressing particularly dim children. Not because we can run fast or fight hard, but because we can turn any social gathering into a hunting ground. We study our prey not through dissection or observation, but through manipulation of their own behavioral patterns. Commander Brixholt's tactical implants were now producing a steady stream of error messages, unable to process the concept of warfare that consisted entirely of standing still. This is monstrous. You've turned academic discourse into some sort of psychological torture experiment, have I? Amelia asked innocently. Or have I simply demonstrated that when humans want to study dangerous predators, we don't need to travel to distant worlds and observe them in their natural habitats. We just need to put them in a room together and wait for them to reveal everything we need to know about how they think, how they react, and how they can be controlled. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with almost audible precision. The audience realized, with the kind of horror typically reserved for cosmic revelations, that they hadn't been attending an academic symposium about dangerous predators. They had been the dangerous predators, unwittingly participating in a live demonstration of human hunting techniques. Every species in this room, Amelia continued, represents a different type of galactic threat. Reality manipulators, dimension-phasing hunters, thought-consuming parasites, the kind of creatures that keep civilizations awake at night. And in 15 minutes of complete inactivity, one human has reduced you all to nervous wrecks by doing absolutely nothing more threatening than breathing. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This wasn't the silence of confusion or mounting terror. This was the silence of beings who had just discovered that their place in the cosmic food chain was significantly lower than they'd previously imagined. "So, when you return to your respective civilizations," Amelia concluded, gathering her simple datapad and preparing to leave, "remember this moment. Remember that somewhere in the galaxy, there's a species that can turn a room full of apex predators into frightened prey animals simply by standing still and letting them think." She paused at the edge of the stage, looking back at the assembled academics with the casual interest of a researcher who had just concluded a successful experiment. "Oh, and one more thing," Amelia added, her voice carrying the cheerful tone of someone sharing an amusing anecdote at a dinner party. "The security personnel you've been calling for. They've been watching this entire demonstration from the observation deck, along with representatives from the Galactic Defense Council, the Intergalactic Trade Commission, and several other organizations that suddenly find themselves very interested in establishing diplomatic relations with Earth." The color drained from faces that possessed the biological capability for color draining. Those that didn't possess such capability found creative ways to express their horror through involuntary appendage twitching. You see, when the galaxy's most dangerous predators all gather in one place to compare notes on how to be more terrifying, it tends to attract attention from beings whose job it is to worry about such things. They wanted to know if humanity represented a threat to galactic stability. She smiled that perfectly pleasant, utterly terrifying smile again. "I believe I've provided them with a comprehensive answer." Dr. Vextai's voice cracked like ancient parchment. This was all planned? The entire symposium was a setup?" "Oh, heavens, no," Amelia laughed, the sound somehow more unsettling than her previous silence. "The symposium was perfectly legitimate. I simply saw an opportunity to demonstrate why humans don't need to travel across the galaxy hunting dangerous predators. We're much more efficient at making dangerous predators come to us, gather in convenient locations, and voluntarily demonstrate their weaknesses while we take notes." The implications hit the audience like a cascade of falling civilizations. Every secret they'd revealed, every psychological vulnerability they'd displayed, every moment of panic and confusion, all of it had been observed, recorded, and filed away by beings whose existence most of them had barely acknowledged. "Sweet dreams," she added pleasantly, and walked away. The auditorium remained silent long after her footsteps had faded, filled with beings who were slowly coming to terms with the most uncomfortable truth in the galaxy, that the most dangerous predator was the one that could make you hunt yourself. And somewhere in the depths of space, Earth continued its quiet orbit around an unremarkable star, home to a species that had just reminded the galaxy why evolution sometimes produces nightmares disguised as academic presentations.